All right, we're going to be talking about family development theory and the latest version of it, which is called life course perspective. And this is really about patterns of changes experienced by families as they move through kind of stages and events of the family life course. This theory has gone through several phases, as you can see, and we'll be focusing mainly on the first and last phases, but I'll give you a quick overview of all of them. So the first phase, the family life cycle by Duval, really the idea has been around since the late 1700s, this idea of a family life cycle, but Duval began to put it down in kind of a theoretical framework in the 1940s and 50s. And we're going to focus on that in a couple of slides coming up. And then Aldous, she kind of built on Duval and was thinking more about the family career rather than a life cycle, because families don't actually return to where they started. You know, they keep progressing like you might in a career. And then in the third phase, family development theory by James White, he really tried to make it a formal theory with clear theoretical propositions. And you might find a theory paper article using his model. It's not as widespread. And then the last iteration is life course perspective, and we'll focus in more on that at the end of the PowerPoint. And it's very popular in family studies right now, and it's easiest to find research on it for the theory paper just by searching for life course perspective. Diachronic time just means change over time. And it's the basic idea is that in order to understand families, we need to view them over time. So for example, I have a colleague who studies low-income, typically non-custodial fathers and their involvement with their kids over time. So he'll investigate how their own dads interacted with them, and then how these young fathers interact with their kids in their 20s or their 30s. Families undergo stages of development just like individuals. This is the next assumption. So you've learned about other stage theories like Piaget. And so we might imagine that we could have a stage of a couple coming together, and then there's tasks associated with that stage, like of dividing labor, of negotiating sexual intimacy, and resolving conflict and communication styles. The idea that how a family does at one stage predicts how well they will do at the next. It's this, to understand families now, we need to know where they've been. And if we can have a sense of that, we can predict some trajectories of where they might end up, right? So if they've already been struggling, then there's a decent chance they might keep struggling. It's also important to pay attention to context in this theory. How does income, race and ethnicity, sexual orientation, your time in history, your geography, your work context, how does that things like that influence a family or an individual's experience of maybe a birth or death or discrimination? And then this last piece, individual development influences family members and overall development, this kind of reciprocal effects. And so this is kind of similar to that interdependence idea from family systems. So for example, when I was in 8th grade, my mom's mom died. And the end of my grandmother's life really launched my mom into her own midlife crisis. And she was trying to figure out what to do with her life, and she was going back to school. And as she would say, everything was up for grabs during that time. Her marriage, her spirituality, her career path, she was really renegotiating her identity. And as you could imagine, all this individual development in my mom affected the rest of the family. My dad had to work less and focus more on household labor. I had to babysit my brother, which he hated and was probably a challenge to his development. And there was no one around now, because my mom was going back to school and work, to keep me from watching soap operas, which really gave me, as a 13-year-old, freedom that I loved and perhaps that I needed developmentally. If you've taken other HDFS classes, you've learned or write about adolescent or adult development, and you realize that we don't just stop developing when we're 20 or 25, but it happens throughout our lives. And so I think it's just important to remember that parents aren't just audience members, watching their kids' development. We certainly are audience members. We spend a lot of time on the sidelines and in the audience, clapping and cheering them on. But we move from that to, for example, taking our own stage, doing our own developmental tasks. And so it's just important to remember that each person in the family is doing their own developmental tasks, and this is always influencing one another. So remember, Duvall's family life cycle was the first phase of this set of theories, and developed in the 1940s and 50s, and it was really based on the traditional family, or that SNAF, the standard North American family that we talked about in the What is a Family lecture. So as you view the stages, the 8 stages on the next slide, consider what you think are the limitations of this model. So this chart nicely illustrates the 8 stages of Duvall's family life cycle, and then also the tasks that go with us. So it helps illustrate that idea of stage and task. But you can imagine that there might be some challenges to this model. So I'd like you to think about your own family and whether or not you fit in one of these 8 stages at all, or if you fit in more than one. And by doing so, it'll help kind of articulate how this model was basically too limited, right? And not all families do all these tasks. Not everybody has a partner, not everybody has kids, but they still might be a family. And there might be stages that we do now that aren't reflected in this model. So for example, a cohabiting couple now often happens before a married couple, or there might be a divorced and co-parenting couple somewhere in there too, or family, or where do single parents fit in? So we've already talked some about family stages and tasks in the previous slides, but stages are considered basically periods of stability within a family, where the family structure and the roles become more stable and predictable. And then as we move to a different stage, or the next stage, then we are in transition and things are less predictable, right? Less stable. And so generally there's higher levels of stress during transitions. So for example, there's a decline in relationship satisfaction during the transition to parenthood, on average, not for everybody. There's a risk of depression when people become empty nesters or when they retire. And so this is a time when families have to change kind of roles, and families, maybe the family composition or family structure is changing. So for example, during the transition to parenthood, people often become more traditional in their gender roles than they expected to, or there might be conflict around kind of negotiating gendered roles. And then transitions also have these elements of whether or not they are on time or off time, what the timing of them is, and whether or not they're normative or non-normative. And sometimes these kind of blur together, but on time and normative is kind of what's expected, and off time is unexpected, and sometimes also non-normative. So examples of off time and perhaps also non-normative events are giving birth to a baby when your older children are already in college and you're in your 40s, or having a parent die when you're a teenager, or nowadays getting married at 18. So sometimes events are both off time and non-normative, like an unplanned teen pregnancy. Non-normative, unplanned, and teen pregnancy being off time. But sometimes it's non-normative and it's not about the timing. So an example of this might be having a child with special needs, which could be an on-time event in your late 20s, but it's unexpected that you would have a child with special needs. And so what is considered on time or off time, and normative and non-normative, is often determined by social norms. So for example, cohabitation used to be considered a non-normative transition, but now it's considered more normative. The life course perspective, if you remember, is the latest version of kind of the family development, family life course set of theories. And so if you want to write your theory paper on this, you should search for life course perspective, and the library handout helps you with that. So the life course perspective uses all the concepts and propositions we've talked about so far in this PowerPoint, and then it adds a few more. So life course perspective expands our understanding of time and has this concept of multiple time clocks. And the first one is ontogenetic, which is individual time or your chronological age. It's basically how old are you at any given point in time, or at any point in time that we collected data from you. If we're researchers, were your subjects 9? Are they 21? Are they 65? And so in these pictures on this slide, these two women, high school seniors, are the same age in the picture, right? 18. And then cohort is based on the year that you're born. What generation are you a part of? The boomers, Gen X, Gen Y? And then researchers might look at how your experiences vary by cohort. So we take these two high school senior women again. The women graduating in the 1960s probably had very different plans for work and family than the women graduating in the 1990s, even though they had the same ontogenetic time or the same chronological age. And then historical basically refers to events that occur with the passage of time and how they influence individuals and families. So if we go back to these female high school seniors and we think of the women's movement and how we can think about how that changed career options. So the high school senior in the 1960s may have decided to be a teacher because that was one of the 4 jobs available to her. You know, the rest were things like secretary, nurse, domestic. But the one in the 1990s maybe decided to be a teacher because she really likes kids. It occurred to me that perhaps one reason my kids' teachers are nicer than my teachers were is because women have more occupations open to them, and only those who enjoy kids become teachers. Here's a few more concepts specific to the life course perspective, but again, grounded in what we've already learned in this theory. This concept of social context, which we've talked about a little bit already, and that we really have to take into account, you know, basically the Bronfenbrenner ecological model, right, of what's in the microsystem and exosystem and macrosystem. So those kinds of things, right? Context, as we often talk about it in HDFS. And then this concept of heterogeneity, which is basically that over an individual's lifetime and then over throughout history, there's basically increasing diversity, variance, and difference. So historically, family can take a lot more diverse forms than it used to. And also, when we think about as we get older, we often become, you know, more different or more unique or have kind of our own different pathways. So when I think back to my college friends when I was in college, it seemed like we were a lot more similar than we are when I meet them now, right? We have a lot differences that I notice a lot more as I've gotten older, as we've become more kind of heterogeneous, generous, I don't know if that's the right word, over time. Okay, so then meaning is what, you know, the meaning that individuals give to changes throughout the life course. And this can be like the meaning that they make based on historical time or their cohort or their context. So for example, the meaning of fathers' roles are different now compared to how we thought about a father's role in the 1980s, or parents raising a transgender child in the 1990s, and the meaning that they made out of it is different than the meaning that parents might be making raising a transgender child today. Or the meaning might vary, but whether or not you're, you know, an African-American parent with a transgender child in New York City versus, you know, a Caucasian parent with a transgender child in Kansas. And then trajectory is just this idea that within one person's individual or ontogenetic time, we can, and social context, they have kind of a life path. You know, trajectory just means life path. And so a Caucasian growing up in Berkeley, California will have a different trajectory than an African-American growing up in Detroit. Or a woman choosing to have a child before establishing her career is going to have a different trajectory than a woman who's establishing her career first and then having a child later. Linked lives just builds on that idea of development is reciprocal, that families have a shared history. Oftentimes we know patterns repeat across generations. Families might have traditions of farming or being medical professionals, or as family therapists learn, there can be patterns across generations of negative things like substance abuse or suicide or violence or scapegoating and favoritism. So families obviously have linked lives. we influence one another, like interdependence in systems theory says, but obviously we have linked lives just by taking this class together. We are influencing each other and perhaps even altering our trajectories. Here's an example of how linked lives was used in a research study. So this study investigated how, parents perhaps in their 40s, 50s, or 60s were influenced by what was happening for their adult children, say in their 20s, 30s, or 40s. And basically what they found is that when the adult children are doing better, not divorcing, staying married, then parents generally feel better themselves. They have less depression. And then they have more depression if their own kids are struggling. So this is just an example of that linked lives, that development is reciprocal, that interdependence idea. And the researchers really explicitly used that concept of linked lives. This graph illustrates the life course concept of trajectory and perhaps cohort. So it's one cohort, all the same birth year, yet 3 different trajectories of delinquency by age. So it also kind of shows us that idea of heterogeneity in trajectory. So there's those that were little to no delinquency, and then there were those that started getting into trouble earlier on, but then maybe got some intervention and got back on track faster. And then there were those that didn't really start getting into trouble until later in adolescence, and then were a little bit later in turning it around. And of course, there's probably a 4th trajectory up here of people who got into trouble and didn't really turn it around.